We are live. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And we're celebrating Epic Earth all month long as we start a new year and a new decade. We're highlighting amazing places, people, and fantastic things from around the globe. So thank you guys for joining us for that. Right now, we've got three classes joining us from across North America. I'm going to give them a chance to say hi before we dive in with our speaker. So we've got Miss Miller's grade 5s in Brampton, Ontario. Hi, guys.
Hi!
Hey, welcome in. We've got Miss Parrish's grade 5-6s in Petrolia, Ontario, quickly becoming like the most popular place we have sessions from. Hi, Petrolia. Welcome in. And just joining us a second ago, we've got Mrs. Camarina's grade 3s in Compton in California. Hi, guys. There's so many of you. Did we get like the whole town? That's awesome. Way to go. Anyway, of course, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live in Banff National Park, one of the most beautiful, iconic, and storied national parks in the entire world, one of the best places in Canada for sure, by Alex Jones. So she is a fire communications officer, and today she's going to talk to us about conservation action, rekindling the spark in Banff National Park. When most people think of fire, they think of this destructive, terrifying force. She's going to explain a little bit of the nuance behind that and maybe how fire can be used for good as well, which is a topic that's really big right now in the news with everything happening in Australia. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alex. Thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Hey guys. So my name is Alex Jones, of course, and I'm here in Banff National Park. Now, my role is something called a fire communications officer. And basically what that means is I educate the public about the role that fire plays on the landscape. And during times of wildfire, it's my role to give information to the public so that they stay safe and well informed. Now, to get started today, it's so important that we acknowledge that we're within the territory of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 First Nations. Now, historically, there's a long-standing connection to this land by many different Indigenous groups, including the Métis Nation homeland. And these lands and waters in Banff have been used for millennia, for sustenance, ceremony, and travel, of course. So there's that really long-standing connection to these lands by many different Indigenous groups. So I just want to take this moment to say thank you to them for their stewardship and for sharing these beautiful lands with us today. So I guess the big question is, where is Banff National Park? Now, of course, Banff is within Canada. It's within the province of Alberta, and it lies within the Rocky Mountains. It's about an hour and a half west of the city of Calgary. So it's very close to a big city, which is one of the reasons why it's so popular. Banff is Canada's first national park, which makes it 135 years old today, which is thankfully much older than I am. Now, Banff is a very special place for many different reasons. And people have been traveling through these mountains for millennia, for thousands of years. But nowadays, people come to Banff to enjoy things like our wildlife, like grizzly bears. They come to enjoy our waters that are these beautiful turquoise blue colors. They're really breathtaking. And that photo is at Moraine Lake, which is a popular spot. And sometimes they come to go hiking or to explore nature so that they can connect with the natural world, or maybe even just connect to themselves in a very serene place. And I'm really lucky because I get to not only live here in the Rocky Mountains, which is really cool, but I get to work for the Parks Canada agency. And Parks Canada is basically the caretaker of the national parks. So what we do is we work really hard to ensure that this place is protected for not only present generations like you and me, but for future generations as well. And we work really hard to ensure something called ecological integrity. Now, ecological integrity is this really gross word, but basically what it means is that we work hard to make sure that Banff is healthy and that it functions the way that it should. Because when it functions properly, like a well-oiled machine, what we see are healthy waters, healthy wildlife, healthy plants and trees, and of course, healthy people. But something that hasn't been functioning properly for quite some time now is fire. Now, most areas within our park experience fire every 50 to 100 years. And we know that a few different ways. We know that because of archaeological evidence, like soil can tell us that there's been a fire. We know that through historical record keeping. We know it through Indigenous knowledge, and we know it through the trees themselves. So if we have a look at this guy here, this is a tree cookie. And what we're looking at are the rings of life. So for every year of the tree's life, we're going to see this ring grow, which was at one point the outside of the tree. And what we can see is this is an old tree. It was about 142 years old before it was cut down. And what I want to point out is this line right here. So this is something called a fire scar. What happened is when a fire moved through the forest, it damaged the outside of the tree. But the tree was strong, it was healthy enough that it survived the fire. And over time, the tree healed itself and continued to grow. You see all of those years of life. So what's really cool is after a fire, this tree continued to grow for another 106 years. So it fits in with fire moving through our landscape every 50 to 100 years. So these are one of the ways that we tell how often a fire moves through Banff, and we know that it's a natural process. So think of fire kind of like spring cleaning. Every 50 to 100 years, Mother Nature does some spring cleaning. Fire moves through the landscape and it clears out the old, dead, and dying vegetation. And what we're left with is logs on the ground. The forest is a bit more open now because some of those old trees have fallen down. And after a couple weeks, we start seeing grasses pop up and some new life growing in. And as decades pass, the forest grows and grows and grows. And then within the 50 to 100 years, we see another large wildfire that starts everything over again. However, over the past 150 years, fire has almost completely disappeared from our landscape. And what you'll see on screen is a picture of an area in Banff. The light areas in those valley bottoms between the mountains, those are open meadows. Those are grasslands. There's no forest there. There's a few trees, but it's not heavily forested. But if you look at the top of the screen or the bottom of the screen, you'll notice it's quite dark, and that is forest. Now, this image, this is something that we want to see in Banff because there's a lot of diversity. There's different habitat for different species because some species don't like living in heavily forested areas. However, this photo was taken over 100 years ago, and this is what Banff looks like today. And you'll notice all of those trees have grown into those open meadows. There's no longer those light colored areas. This is because fire has not moved through the landscape. And as a result, we're losing diversity. We're losing diversity in species, in diversity in habitat, places where different plants and animals are attracted to. So the big question is, how did we get here? How did fire stop? Well, in order to understand that, we actually have to go back quite a while ago, over 100 years ago, to see how people and their personal values and their beliefs actually altered our entire ecosystem. Because as you'll learn, people are really good at altering ecosystems. So just like wind or rain, fire has always been a part of our landscape. And what I want you guys to look at is this image on screen. I just want you to notice it's really foggy. There might have been some fire moving through the landscape, a bit of smoke. This is a serene image to me. It's an image that shows me that fire has moved through the landscape at one point, but I see all of that lush vegetation on the ground. Feels like new life is coming forward. Because with each passing of fire, forests are opened up and new life comes forward. And that's what we're missing in Banff. Now, for thousands of years, people coexisted with fire. They really understood that without fire, nature was unable to thrive. And instead of treating fire like an enemy, different indigenous groups used fire as a tool. They used it to open up trails so that they could travel through the forest a bit more easily. They used it to open up forests and create meadows like you see on screen, because in turn, that attracts game species like elk. Fire really shapes our forest. It clears away old, dead, and diseased trees, and it allows sunlight to reach the forest floor. This, in turn, makes better growing conditions for all kinds of plants and wildlife. But before new life can come forward, we have to start here. So again, have a look at this image. Now, when I look at this image, I feel a bit differently than the first one. There's no green. It doesn't seem like there's any life. It might seem a little bleak, quite dark. The fire has moved through and the trees are quite dark on the outside. If I look at the ground, it's covered in soot. Now, this might seem really damaging. But like I said, this is where we have to start before new life comes forward. Because underneath that soot, what we're seeing is nutrients being recycled in the soil. So the soil under that soot is actually becoming healthier. And believe it or not, within a few weeks, we actually start seeing grass species start to pop up. Within a couple of months, we start seeing shrubs and maybe even tiny little tree saplings starting to come forward. And we see flowers that normally wouldn't grow in the forest because it's too dark. So fire really opens things up for new life to come forward. We just have to start here. But understandably, this can be really scary and really unattractive to people. I mean, it might not seem so beautiful. So understandably, if we go back in time, over 100 years ago, actually to the early 1800s, when settlers first started arriving here in the Rocky Mountains from Europe, this is where we really started to see fire disappear from our landscape. This is because they did not understand the ecology behind fire, and they were worried that fire was just too damaging. It threatened their livelihoods, it threatened their homes, their businesses, and of course, it threatened human life. So every time a fire popped up, it was quickly extinguished. And by 1909, after the national park was established, the Canadian Park Service actually hired people to extinguish every single wildfire started in the park. They were called fire and game guardians, and they're basically like modern day park wardens. And at the time, people were relieved that the Park Service was taking wildfire so seriously because they felt safer that the wildfires were now being put out, that they were being controlled. And over time, the ability to put out these fires became much more effective, because at one point, we were relying on horses carrying hose to get to fires. Now imagine if a fire started on the side of a mountain. That's a lot of work to get there. So thankfully, as time passed, the ability to put out fires became much better. We had better technology, and we didn't have to just rely on horses to carry all of our gear. But because we got so good at putting out wildfires, fire disappeared. And now what we're left with is what you see on screen. If you were to walk through the forest here in Banff nowadays, you're going to see a lot of this. There's a lot of old trees that have fallen over. The forest floor is covered in branches and logs, and there's very little diversity, not a lot of different kinds of life growing within our forests, which means there's not enough wildlife habitat for some species. And because it's so dark in our forests, sun-loving plants aren't able to grow. So we start to see species disappear altogether, which is not how it should be in a national park where everything should be protected. And when everything is so dry and there's tons of stuff on the ground, the chances of very severe wildfires greatly increase. So believe it or not, without regular intervals of fire, without frequent smaller wildfires, it actually increases the chance of a very severe damaging wildfire like you see on screen. And so fire helps us prevent fire. Now, close to 100 years after the park was first established in 1885, Parks Canada fire managers knew that something needed to change. They were really starting to see the devastating results of not allowing fire to burn on our landscape. They knew they had to bring it back. The big question was, how do you do that? How do you bring fire back safely? Do they let a wildfire burn if lightning strikes and a fire starts? Do they just leave that alone and let nature take its course? What if the fire starts too close to town? What if the fire gets too big? How would they control that? How could they control something that by nature is wild? So they did a bit of research and a whole lot of planning, and it took quite a few years, but by 1983, we actually came up with something to help. It's called prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is another kind of gross word, but let's break it down a little bit. Prescribed fires are intentionally lit fires under very controlled conditions in order to achieve a goal, like forest health. Prescribed fires are very similar to a person going to the doctor. So if you're not feeling well and you need the help of a doctor, you'll go to the doctor's office, you'll explain your symptoms, the doctor will listen, they'll do some research, they'll come up with a plan, and they might even give you some medication. If they give you medication, they'll say, you need to take this little pill twice a day for 7 days and you'll feel a whole lot better. And as long as you follow that prescription, you will feel better. So the doctor prescribed you something with the goal of making you healthier. We prescribe fire to the landscape with the goal of making the landscape healthier. That's a prescribed fire. So in 1883, we were able to do just that near Two Jack Lake. And Two Jack Lake is actually really close to the town of Banff. It's not like we started way in the backcountry. We actually started quite close to the community of Banff. And if you were to visit Banff today, you will see some effects of fire near Two Jack Lake at Lake Minnewanka. Now, after that successful prescribed fire at Two Jack Lake, our prescribed fire program only continued to grow. In fact, it's one of the primary focuses of Banff's modern day fire program. And on screen, you'll see a prescribed fire we did at Moose Meadows. And towards the far corner, you'll see the highway near the mountain. So again, it's close to people, but it's done under very controlled conditions. And this is another prescribed fire that we did. I want to show you this photo because it's arguably one of my favorite things about the fire program. You'll see a helicopter in the sky, and below the helicopter, there's something hanging down. And that canister is something called a heli torch. So within that canister, there's basically jet fuel and a bit of gelling agent inside of it. And someone in the helicopter controls that, and they can actually drip this goop down that is lit on fire as it comes out of the canister. Yesterday, my fire manager described this goop that comes out as it looking kind of like snot, which is really gross, but you get the point. It comes out in this glob and it's lit on fire, it's dropped on the trees, and that's one way we can start a prescribed fire, particularly in times where we don't want any of our fire crews to be on the ground or near the area. And we can start these really nice burns on the side of hills safely. And safety is always our top priority. Now, it takes a lot of work, a lot of planning, and a lot of ground support to be able to do a prescribed fire, because fire, if not used carefully, if not used knowledgeably, it can lead to a loss of property and even a loss of life. So we take prescribed fire and all fire very seriously in the park. And that's why we have such knowledgeable staff writing prescribed fire plans. These prescribed fire plans can take 2 to 3 years to even go about implementing. And before we can drop fire into the forest, we need to have the right conditions to be able to do so. So we can go 10 years without actually burning an area that we want to burn just because it's not safe enough to do so. So we do it very controlled. However, when used appropriately, fire's amazing because it clears away those dead and dying materials on the ground, like the trees. It recycles nutrients back into the soil. It opens up forests. It creates meadows and grasslands for all kinds of wildlife and plant species. And it makes communities safer because it reduces the risk of very large, severe wildfires down the road. This ultimately keeps everyone safer and healthier, thus restoring ecological integrity in Banff National Park. And that, my friends, is how we rekindled the spark in Banff National Park. Thank you, guys.
That is quite the picture to end it. Thank you so much, Alex. That was fantastic. And yeah, let's dive in with questions, guys. In addition to our 3 classes live, we've got a bunch of groups watching on YouTube live. So So if you guys want to type in your questions in the chat bar, I will happily take them and pass them along to Alex. But yeah, let's get underway. We're going to start with Miss Miller's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question, come on up.
Oh, sorry, did you say Miss Miller's class?
Yeah, if you guys have a question.
Perfect, Katie.
So, you know the invasive species of pine beetles?
Yeah.
So would the fires like help control them? Because you know how they eat the trees, the inside of the trees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first things first is we've heard a lot about pine beetle moving through forests and damaging trees, but it is important to note that pine beetle is native to the Rocky Mountains. It is a natural process, just like fire, that helps clear away those older trees because they generally only target the weaker trees. However, because of fire suppression through the years, the fact that we have so many dead and dying trees, that's why mountain pine beetle moves so quickly through the forest and can have such devastating results. So to answer your question, yes, fire can help those kind of situations because it removes those old dead and dying trees and leaves healthier, more resilient trees that the beetles can't target as easily. So it does slow down the progression of mountain pine beetle or stop it in some areas altogether.
Very
Good
cool.
question.
Yeah, great question, guys. All right, let's go to Miss Parrish's class. If you guys have a question, come on up.
How long does a wildfire or like the controlled fires usually burn for?
Yeah, good question. So how long do prescribed fires last? Well, it really depends on the size of the prescribed fire. We could potentially burn an area within a day or two if it's smaller. We might be out there for a week or two if it's a larger scale prescribed fire. But because it's so controlled, the actual fire, the flame, it doesn't last for that long, but there's a lot of cleanup on either side to make sure the fire is completely extinguished, as well as the before planning process, which can take a few years.
Excellent. All right, and let's head to California, guys. Miss Camarina's class, if you guys have one, come on up.
Are there any endangered animals in the national forest?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Oh, the microphone too, by the way. What a cool classroom that is.
That's a great question. Are there any endangered species here? Yes, we do have endangered species. One of which that people don't really think about is a tree. It's called the white bark pine tree. It's a species at risk here in Banff National Park, and it's one of my focuses here. Basically, white bark pine and fire are linked because as the forest ages, it starts moving up the mountain and it starts causing a lot of shadow on the forest floor. It makes the forest really dark. So this endangered tree that needs sunlight to grow, it starts disappearing because the forest is too dark. So by using prescribed fire, we can create habitat for this species at risk, the white bark pine. We also have birds. We have all kinds of species at risk here in the park. And we do have a section on our website devoted to it, which I can send the link to Jesse afterwards.
Please do. We love sharing things from Banff with all the classes when we're done. And I encourage that class too. Check out our bison presentations with Banff and our West Slope cutthroat trout presentations, both on some species that they've been reintroducing into the park. It's a really great story. All right. Yeah, to the YouTube classes again, type them in. I know some teachers that are already there, so please do send along some questions. But let's do another round with our live classes. So Miss Miller's class, if you guys want to come up again, you are good to go.
Okay, for trees to regrow. Okay, go.
How long does it take for the trees to regrow?
After.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing right, how long does it take for trees to grow after a fire? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so after a fire, it really depends on the kind of tree. It will take a couple years for those little saplings to pop up. It really depends. Within a year, you can see these little sun-loving trees start to pop up, but it takes decades for them to grow into full trees. So it is a long process. Usually immediately after a fire, we see more grass, more bushes, flowers, and aspen trees, for example. And then we start seeing the conifers growing in and building into that forest. So it is a long process to get back to another dense forest, but that's the beauty of life, is it gives all kinds of species a chance to live and thrive.
Nice. All right, let's go back to Miss Parrish's class. Come on up, guys.
When you do prescribed fires, wouldn't you kill some species?
Yeah, so do prescribed fires kill things that are like there as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a great question. What happens to the animals? That's always on the top of people's minds. And if we think of right now in Australia, we're seeing a huge loss of wildlife there, which is really unfortunate. When we get these really large scale wildfires that last months and months and months, the ability for animals to flee the area, it gets harder and harder. Animals get tired. There's less places to go. There's less water sources, and so you start to see a lot of loss of biodiversity. Thankfully, with prescribed fire, because they're so controlled, they don't last that long. It's only a couple of days of actual fire, if that sometimes. And so because wildlife have evolved to understand that fire is part of a landscape, they sense it and they're able to leave the area. And what we see are animals like elk and deer and bears. When they sense fire, whether it's smoke or however they sense it, they flee the forest, they run away. We see birds fly away and escape. And then smaller animals like mice, they're actually able to bury under the soil and hide under the soil surface. And so as a fire moves across the top, that little critter is safe beneath the ground. So that's another way that animals protect themselves from fire. So prescribed fire, thankfully, isn't as damaging as large-scale wildfires.
Excellent. I'm so glad we got that question. It's always great to get in. All right, Miss Camarina's class, you guys have like 8,000 students. So I'm going to take 2 questions in a row from you guys. So we'll come and take one from you with the microphone, and then we'll come right back, okay? You good? Yeah, you're good to go.
As a kid, are there any ways that I can help endangered animals in the national forest?
What a great question.
That's a really great question. So being outside of the national park back home, one way that you can help these endangered animals is by sharing the animal stories, facts about these endangered animals with your friends and family. Because one of the biggest ways that we help both animals and the park is by providing education to the public. Because if people don't know that these animals exist and the importance of these animals, they might not see the need to protect them. And if they don't see the need to protect them, then perhaps the funding doesn't go to conservation programs. So that's why education is so important. So what you can do back home is share these stories, check out all of the online resources we have and share them. And that's truly how you can help these guys back home.
Yep. I've been saying all week long to a lot of classes, highlighting how they can be involved, that this is the best time to be a kid interested in climate and biodiversity ever in the world. Like, your voices are being heard more than ever. Look at marches all around the world. Look at how politicians are taking that very seriously. So it's a really exciting time to be engaged and involved in a classroom right now. So great question, guys. All right, to Ms. Camarina's class, I'm gonna come right back to you. If you guys have a second question, come on up.
How do we stop wildfires in California?
Yeah.
That's a good question. How do you stop wildfires in California? Well, I can't speak on behalf of California because I'm all the way in Banff National Park, but I can talk about the ways to prevent wildfires in general. One way to prevent wildfires is by being very careful with where you start fires for camping. So for example, if you are out hiking and you want to have a campfire, sometimes depending on the time of year, it's actually not safe to even start that fire because it can spread so quickly. And so here in the national parks, we have these very special fire pits that are metal and they're quite tall that prevent the embers shooting out of the fire and starting wildfires. Sometimes we even put fire restrictions or fire bans in place so that we prevent accidental fires. And so if you know it's a very dry time wherever you are in the world, it's important to acknowledge that your little wildfire could easily become a big wildfire. And so being very careful with that, following all of the rules people put out there for fire. Those are some different ways. And also keeping your home fire smart. So something we do here in the national park and that's done across North America is removing trees that are very close to your home. Because if trees are not touching the roof of your house, it's less likely to catch on fire during a wildfire. So pushing the trees back from your home and creating a buffer around, that's fire smart. So I encourage you to check out Fire Smart Canada and you can learn more about that.
Excellent. All right. I'm going to take a question from a group on YouTube and then we'll do one more round with our live classes and we'll all be done. So the question from the group on YouTube is, how do you control these fires? You start a prescribed fire. How do you keep it in check from spreading like a wildfire?
Good question. How do we prevent prescribed fire from escaping the boundary? Well, one of the ways is before we start the actual prescribed fire, we'll do a fire guard in the area. So a fire guard is a small area that we burn in advance so that when we start the prescribed fire and it moves towards the fire guard, there's no longer any trees or what we call fuel for the fire to catch on to. And so it reaches this bare area, the fire guard, and it stops. It can't keep spreading because there's nothing to catch on fire. That's one way we control it. We use a lot of sprinkler systems. We have staff on the ground. In some areas, they'll actually dig big trenches in the ground to stop the spread of fire. So there's a ton of different ways, but it all comes down to a lot of planning. So anticipating where the fire will go if the wind changes direction, all of that.
Excellent. All right. Let's do our last round of 3. Let's go to Miss Miller's class to kick us off. Come on up again, guys.
So in Australia,
Mhm.
there's a lot of wildfires, and
Yeah.
if something serious were to happen in Banff,
Mhm.
do you guys have a plan, and how fast would it spread?
Yeah, that's a great question. So something we spend a lot of time on here in the park is planning for wildfires and creating fire guards or fuel breaks in the event that a fire were to occur. So one of the ways that we address the potential for a large scale wildfire is the Park Service trains with the town of Banff and Lake Louise, and we ensure that all the firefighters within the region are using the same equipment, that we can work together as a team, that we understand each other's communication processes. So there's a lot of planning with other agencies in the event that a wildfire starts, so we can be very effective. Another thing we do is we will create those fuel breaks. So just like the fire guard, a fuel break is a large space of land without a lot of fuel, without a lot of trees to catch fire. So these areas can be quite large, and it's a big buffer in the event a wildfire were to move towards it. Because if the fire moves toward that fuel break, there's nothing to catch on fire, and it's going to protect the town over here. And one more way that we prevent wildfires from spreading quickly within the park is by fire smart practices. So we'll thin out the forest, we'll take some trees out of the forest so that the fire can't move quickly because the trees aren't as close. We'll remove trees from being really close to houses, all kinds of things. So definitely check out our website because we go through quite a few of these things that we've done to protect the town. And to address your last question, how quickly could a fire move through the landscape? Well, that all depends on the weather and the wind and where it starts. If the fire starts at the base of a mountain, fire moves really quickly uphill, so it can spread really fast.
Right. Excellent question. Great answer. Thank you so much for that, Alex.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. Let's go to Miss Parrish's class. Come on up again, guys.
What do you like best about your job?
Awesome.
What do I like best about my job? Well, this is pretty cool. I'm pretty keen on this virtual learning thing. But what else I like about my job is I get to communicate with the public during times of fire, not only in the park, but sometimes we get sent to other areas of Canada to help their teams out during wildfires. So this past summer, I got to go to Wood Buffalo National Park, which is at the northern tip of Alberta, right near the Northwest Territories. And I got to work there for about 2.5 weeks. So I do get to travel a bit, which is super cool. And I get to learn about other areas of Canada and how they control fire.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alex. All right, and we'll wrap one more question up, but we'll go back to California with the student who's waiting there. Ms. Camarina's class. Come on up, guys.
How can I become a park ranger?
Yes, awesome question.
This is arguably my favorite question. I would love everyone to become park rangers. So here in Parks Canada, we have a ton of different roles. You could be a park warden, which is like law enforcement. You could be a firefighter, so on our fire crews, putting out the fires. So it really depends on the career path you're interested in. So for example, to become a firefighter for Parks Canada, one of the things that we suggest is going to college or university, learning about the natural world and environmental science. It's important to understand the ecology of fire. And then, of course, you do have to be very physically fit to be a firefighter because they carry really heavy equipment up the side of mountains to fight fires. And they work for long, long hours each day to protect communities. So when you become a firefighter, it's a lot of work, but so rewarding. And then to get my job, you just have to have great communication skills. I did go to school for environmental science, so I have that background. And I definitely recommend, no matter what path you choose, Parks Canada is a great company to work for. We're all about protecting this beautiful landscape, and I couldn't imagine working for anyone else.
Outstanding. Even by the standards of a usual session, this one had some really deep, thoughtful, fantastic questions. So I really want, I really want to thank all the classes, all your students. You guys are really fantastic. Before we wrap up, Alex, is there a place that we can send kids to learn more about Banff National Park, about the fire service, about anything that you'd like to share? Where can we guide the kids when they're done?
Yeah, so go to the Banff National Park website. That's a place you can learn about Banff National Park. We have a fire section on the website. The Alberta Wildfire website is another resource. There's a ton of videos. You can learn how to train to be a firefighter on there. It talks about firefighting. So those are two really good places to go to get more information. And then of course, check our YouTube channel for Parks Canada. Tons of information. You'll find out more than you were probably looking for.
Awesome. So I'll share those with all the classes the moment we're done, so you can look for a link there when we finish up. But yeah, what we do at the end of every session, guys, is I'm going to demute everyone's microphone. And so boys and girls, if you guys could get ready to join me in saying a huge thank you to Alex. You are all now demuted. Go for it. Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate y'all coming in for a fantastic January. Again, Epic Earth. We're celebrating all month long. Check out next month too. Amazing Women in Science, the entire month long. All incredible women from around the world. Alex, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye.
All right.